Paul makes a surprise appearance to criticize John's lyrics. Lennon's response leaves McCartney humiliated. London, September 1971. The Lyceum Ballroom, Strand, Central London. A building of peculiar grandeur sitting at the heart of a city that was still processing the most significant musical divorce in its history. The Beatles had broken up officially 14 months earlier. The legal proceedings were ongoing, ugly, and public in the way that only disputes between extraordinarily famous people with irreconcilable differences can be public. The air between John Lennon and Paul McCartney in September 1971 was not the air between former friends. It was the air between former partners who had made the mistake of knowing each other too completely, who had spent a decade building something extraordinary together and were now spending the years after its destruction proving to the world and to themselves that they were better alone. Tonight, the Lyceum Ballroom held 2,000 people. 2,000 people who had come to hear John Lennon perform material from Imagine, released just 3 weeks earlier to reviews that were simultaneously ecstatic and, in certain quarters, deeply contested. John stood on the stage in a white shirt and jeans. No elaborate staging, no production armor. Just voice, guitar, and the particular emotional nakedness of someone who had decided that truth was more important than performance. He was 40 minutes into his set. The audience was completely still. The specific Lyceum Ballroom silence that performers spend careers trying to achieve. John was in the middle of working class hero. They hurt you at home, and they hit you at school. They hate you if you're clever, and they despise a fool till you're so fucking crazy you can't follow their rules. Nobody noticed the figure who slipped through the side entrance at 9:47 p.m. The venue was dark except for the stage lights. The crowd was facing forward, absorbed completely in what John was doing. The figure moved along the side wall with the practiced ease of someone who understood the geography of performance spaces, who had spent enough time in venues like this to know exactly where to stand to see everything without being seen immediately. Paul McCartney stood in the shadows of the Lyceum Ballroom and watched his former partner perform. He had not been invited. He had not announced his presence to John's management or to the venue. He had simply decided, on some impulse that he had not fully examined, to come. He told himself he was there out of curiosity. That was the version he offered himself as justification. Curiosity about what John was doing, about how the Imagine material worked in a live setting. But underneath the curiosity was something else, something more specific and less comfortable. He was there because of How Do You Sleep, the song John had released as part of Imagine that was, in Paul's view, a direct, personal, and largely unfair attack on his character, his talent, and his artistic worth. A song that had been discussed in every music publication in Britain and beyond. And he was there because of the broader critical narrative building around Imagine. The suggestion that John's solo work represented the true artistic legacy of the Beatles. That without John's vision, the band had been merely excellent rather than extraordinary. Paul had come to the Lyceum Ballroom because he had things to say. Specific, considered, prepared things. About John's lyrics. About what he considered the artistic irresponsibility of dressing private grievances in the language of universal truth. He had not planned to say them publicly, but standing in the shadows of the Lyceum Ballroom, watching John perform to 2,000 rapt listeners, something shifted in his calculation. And Paul McCartney made a decision that he would spend the rest of the evening regretting. To understand what happened that September night, you have to understand the specific, layered complexity of what John and Paul had been doing to each other through their music since the breakup. The Beatles had ended not with a clean break, but with the slow, painful dissolution of something that had been simultaneously a professional partnership and the closest relationship either man had ever had. They had created together at a level that neither could fully replicate alone, and they both knew it. That knowledge was the knife that the breakup twisted. John had fired the first significant musical shot with How Do You Sleep, a song of such specific, targeted venom that it was impossible to interpret as anything other than a direct attack on Paul. The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you've gone you're just another day. Paul's song Another Day had been released as a single earlier that year. John's reference was unmistakable, as was the implication. That Paul's solo work was lightweight, melodically pleasant, emotionally safe. That without John's edge and honesty, Paul's music was merely pretty. Paul had been publicly restrained about How Do You Sleep. He had given measured, diplomatic responses in interviews. He had not fired back with equal directness. He had processed his response through his music, coding it in ways that required specific knowledge of the relationship to decode. But privately, he had been making notes. Specific, detailed, analytical notes about what he considered the lyrical dishonesty of John's solo work. The passages in John Lennon/Plastic Ono Band and Imagine that Paul believed were emotionally manipulative rather than emotionally honest. That used the language of universal truth to deliver personal attacks. That positioned John as a working-class hero while he lived in a mansion. That criticized others for the same commercial compromises that John himself had made. The notes were extensive. They were precise. And they were the kind of criticism that, delivered publicly, would be devastating. Paul had not delivered them publicly. He had discussed them only in private. He had kept them contained. Until tonight. The specific combination of watching John perform to a rapturous audience, hearing the songs that Paul considered dishonest received as profound truths, and the accumulated weight of months of very public musical attack had produced in Paul something that he would later describe as a temporary failure of judgment. He stepped out of the shadows. He walked toward the stage. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John was between songs when a crew member appeared at the side of the stage with an expression that John recognized immediately. The expression of someone delivering information they know will produce an unpredictable reaction. Paul's here, the crew member whispered. He's asking to come up. John's hands stilled on his guitar strings. He looked at the crew member for a moment without speaking. Then he looked out at the 2,000 people in the Lyceum ballroom, who were beginning to stir from the brief pause between songs. Let him up, John said. The crew member blinked. You're sure? Let him up, John repeated, entirely calm. The specific, deliberate calm of someone who has made a decision and is completely at peace with it. What happened next took the audience approximately 12 seconds to process. Paul McCartney walked onto the stage. The recognition spread through the crowd the way recognition spreads when something impossible is happening directly in front of you. A ripple of disbelief moving from the front rows to the back. A collective intake of breath. Then the eruption of sound that 2,000 people make when they understand that they are witnessing something unscheduled, unplanned, and unprecedented. Paul walked to a microphone that a crew member had quickly positioned at center stage. He looked out at the audience. He looked at John. John looked back at him with an expression that nobody in the room could quite read. Not surprise. Not anger. Something more composed than either. The expression of a man who had suspected something like this and had prepared himself in the 30 seconds between being told and watching it occur. Paul McCartney, ladies and gentlemen, John said into his microphone, his voice carrying its familiar Liverpool dry humor. Has anyone told him there's a gig on? The audience laughed, nervously. The laugh of a crowd that doesn't know whether this is friendly or the beginning of something explosive. Paul smiled. The professional smile of someone who had been performing since he was a teenager. John, Paul said. His voice was steady, carrying the authority of someone who has prepared what they're going to say and is committed to saying it. I've been sitting here listening to these songs, and I need to say something. John tilted his head slightly. Go on then. Paul looked at the audience, then back at John. These lyrics, Paul said. The Imagine album. I've been thinking about what they're actually saying underneath what they seem to be saying. The Lyceum ballroom went completely silent. 2,000 people simultaneously stopped breathing. You write about being a working-class hero, Paul said. About the hypocrisy of the establishment. About peace and love and tearing down the walls between people. He paused. And I think the songs are beautiful. I do. But I also think that some of them are saying things that aren't quite true. That are positioning you as something you're not. John said nothing. His face completely still. You live in a mansion, John, Paul said. His voice was not unkind, but it was direct. You write about working-class struggle from a house in Ascot. You criticize me for making commercial music while you're on the biggest label in the world. And some of what sounds like universal truth in these songs is actually something more personal. He took a breath. Some of these lyrics are about me, and they're not fair. And I think you know they're not fair. The silence in the Lyceum ballroom was the most complete silence that venue had ever held. The silence of 2,000 people understanding that they are witnessing something private made catastrophically public. And then John Lennon did something that nobody anticipated. He sat down on the stage floor, cross-legged, guitar in his lap. He looked up at Paul standing at the microphone, and he smiled. Not the defensive smile. Not the dangerous smile. The real one. You're right, John said into his microphone. 2 words, delivered into complete silence. The Lyceum ballroom absorbed them without sound. You're right, John said again. About almost everything you just said. I do live in a mansion. The hypocrisy is real. I've known it and been uncomfortable with it, and put it in the songs because putting uncomfortable things in songs is what I do instead of dealing with them properly. He paused. And yes, some of those lyrics are about you, and some of them aren't fair. Paul stared at him. He had prepared for many responses. Defensiveness, anger, a public counterattack that would turn the Lyceum ballroom into a battlefield. He had not prepared for this. For John Lennon sitting on the floor of his own stage and agreeing with him. In public, in front of 2,000 people. with the specific, costly, devastating grace of someone who has nothing left to protect and has decided that honesty is more interesting than winning. The next 10 minutes were the strangest 10 minutes in the history of the Lyceum Ballroom. Paul stood at the microphone, his prepared argument completely dismantled by the one response he had not prepared for. 2,000 people sat in the peculiar suspended state of witnesses to something that had exceeded their capacity to categorize. And John sat on the floor of the stage and kept talking. Not defensively, not with the combative intelligence that had characterized his public responses to criticism throughout his career. With the specific, unguarded quality of someone who had made a decision to stop managing their own image in real time and was experiencing, for the first time in years, the relief of it. The thing about How Do You Sleep, John said, looking up at Paul, is that it's a good song. I'm not sorry I wrote it. Paul's jaw tightened slightly. But, John continued, I wrote it when I was angrier than I should have been about things that were more complicated than the song suggests. I put things in it that were personal shots dressed up as artistic criticism. And that's the same thing you just accused me of in the Imagine material. He looked out at the audience, then back at Paul. You're the only person who has said that to my face, John said. In public, on a stage, in front of 2,000 people. He paused. That took something. I'm not sure it was the right way to do it, but it took something. Paul stood at the microphone and said nothing, his expression doing several complicated things simultaneously. Sit down, Paul, John said, not unkindly, with the specific ease of someone speaking to a person they know with the intimacy of shared history. A roadie appeared from the wings with a second stool. Paul looked at it for a moment. Then he sat down. The Lyceum Ballroom absorbed this development with a collective intake of breath. An audience that has just watched an impending collision transform, at the last possible moment, into something completely different. Here's what's actually true, John said, after a moment. We both know the songs we've been firing at each other. We both know what they're about. We both know that half of what we've written in the last year has been a conversation with each other that we were too stubborn and too proud to have directly. He looked at Paul steadily. So let's have it directly. Right here, in front of these people. What do you actually think is wrong with the Imagine lyrics? Not the general criticism. The specific one. Paul had not expected to be invited into a conversation. He had expected to deliver his criticism and manage the fallout. He had not expected John Lennon to turn it into a dialogue. But Paul McCartney had been performing since he was a teenager. The skill of adapting to an unexpected situation on stage was one he possessed in equal measure to John. He leaned forward on his stool. The bridge of gimme some truth, Paul said. You position yourself as completely outside the political establishment. But John, we accepted MBEs. We made a record with the Queen's blessing. We were the establishment. You can't write from outside a room you've been sitting in for 10 years. John nodded slowly. Fair point. The working class hero narrative, Paul continued, his voice gaining confidence. You had a hard childhood. That's real, and I know it's real because I was there for some of it. But you've been wealthy since 1963. There's a difference between where you came from and where you are. The songs blur that line in ways that aren't honest. Also fair, John said. Paul stared at him. You're agreeing with me. I'm agreeing with the parts that are correct, John said. Which is most of them. He paused. Does that surprise you? Yes, Paul said. Honestly, without the diplomatic management that usually characterized his public statements. It surprises me too, John said. And something in his voice suggested this was genuinely true. That the act of sitting on this stage and agreeing with his former partner's public criticism was revealing something to him about himself that he hadn't known before he started doing it. The audience of the Lyceum Ballroom had not moved. 2,000 people in the specific suspended state of witnesses to something that had exceeded every expectation they had brought into the building. John's tour manager was standing in the wings with the expression of a man watching a fire and holding a glass of water he understands is insufficient. Here's my problem with your criticism, Paul, John said, after a pause that had lasted long enough for the audience to begin wondering whether the conversation was over. The criticism is correct, but the decision to deliver it here, tonight, in front of these people, on my stage, during my concert, without telling me you were coming, without asking whether this was the right moment or the right method. That was not a fair decision. Paul opened his mouth. Let me finish, John said, not aggressively. With the firm patience of someone who has been listening carefully and is entitled to his turn. You're right about the hypocrisy in the songs. You're right that some of the personal attacks weren't fair. I've just told you that in front of 2,000 people. He stood up from the floor. Not dramatically. Simply. He picked up his guitar. But you came here without telling me. You walked onto my stage without asking. You delivered a prepared criticism in public that you could have delivered privately at any time. We have the same phone number for each other that we've had since 1962. He looked at Paul directly. You could have called. The Lyceum Ballroom was so quiet that the ventilation system was audible. Paul said nothing. The criticism was right, John said. The words measured and deliberate. The method was not. Paul looked at John for a long moment. The expression on his face was the expression of someone who has come to a situation with a full arsenal and has found themselves disarmed. Not by superior force, by the specific, infuriating power of being given exactly what you came for while simultaneously being shown the cost of how you asked for it. He had come to humiliate John with public truth. And John had agreed with every word of it, publicly, freely, without armor. And then, with complete calm, turned the light around. Now was Paul standing in it. "You're right," Paul said quietly. His voice was different now, the prepared quality completely gone. What remained was something more private. The voice of a man speaking to someone he had known since adolescence, with whom he had created the most celebrated music of the 20th century, and from whom he had been separated by a combination of legal dispute, wounded pride, and the specific loneliness of discovering that the thing you built together cannot be replicated alone. "I should have called," Paul said. "Yes," John said simply. "You should have." Another silence. This one different from all the preceding ones. Not the silence of conflict suspended. The silence of something named. Something that had been living between them for 14 months without a name and had finally found one. Paul stood up from the stool. He straightened his jacket. He looked out at 2,000 people watching him with the attentive quiet of witnesses who understand they are present at something significant. "I'm sorry," Paul said, into the microphone, in front of 2,000 people, with the specific difficulty of a man who does not apologize easily and is doing it anyway because the situation has made the alternative impossible. "For coming here like this. Without asking. That wasn't right." He looked at John. "The criticism stands," he said. "But the way I delivered it doesn't." John nodded. "The criticism stands," he agreed. "I'll live with it." Paul turned toward the wings. He was 3 steps from leaving the stage when John spoke again. Paul stopped. "Stay for the rest of the set," John said. The Lyceum ballroom held its breath. Paul turned around. He looked at John for a long moment. Something moved across his face that the audience at the back couldn't read clearly, but that those in the front rows would later describe consistently as the expression of someone choosing between pride and something better than pride. He walked back to the stool. He sat down. John turned to his band and said something too quiet for the microphone to pick up. The musicians nodded, and John Lennon played "How Do You Sleep?" He played it directly to Paul McCartney, sitting 6 feet away on a stool on the Lyceum stage. He played it quietly, with less venom than the album version, with more acknowledgement of the complicated truth that lay beneath its attack. He played it as what it actually was, a wound expressing itself as music, which is what the best songs always are. John's tour manager gave his account of that evening in a 1989 interview with a music journalist who had been tracking the story for years. "I've been in this business for 25 years, he said. "I've seen every possible thing that can happen on a stage. I have never seen anything like what happened at the Lyceum in September 1971. The technical description is that Paul McCartney showed up uninvited, delivered a prepared public criticism of John's lyrics, and John responded by agreeing with it and then pointing out the problem with the method." He paused. "But that technical description misses completely what it felt like to be in the room. What it felt like was watching 2 people who had been fighting through proxies for over a year finally turn and face each other directly, and discovering that the direct conversation was not what either of them had imagined it would be. Paul expected a fight. He got an agreement and a mirror. John expected an attack. He got one, agreed with it, and then taught Paul something about the difference between the content of a criticism and the method of its delivery. Neither of them left the stage the same person who had walked onto it. The people who were in the Lyceum ballroom that September night carried the memory with the specific quality of people who have witnessed something that doesn't fit the existing categories of their experience. They talked about it, in the years that followed, with the careful precision of people trying to describe something that language was not quite equipped to hold. A journalist named Sarah Ellerton, who had been in the audience and had written a brief, deliberately understated account of the evening for her publication the following day, gave a longer interview in 1985 in which she tried to articulate what she had witnessed. "The word that keeps coming back to me," she said, "is exposure. What happened on that stage that night was a double exposure. John was exposed, by Paul's criticism, as someone whose political persona contained genuine contradictions. And Paul was exposed, by John's response, as someone who had chosen a method of delivering truth that undermined the truth itself. And the remarkable thing was that both of them accepted the exposure. Paul accepted John's agreement with his criticism. John accepted Paul's point about the contradictions. And then John made his own point about method, and Paul accepted that too. In a relationship that had been characterized for over a year by each of them refusing to accept anything the other said, that double acceptance was extraordinary. It didn't fix anything. The legal battles continued. The public disputes continued. The music they made about each other continued, though with slightly different quality after that night. But something changed. Something that was visible in the way each of them spoke about the other in the years that followed. a slight but real reduction in the absolute certainty of each man's public dismissal of the other. As if each of them, after that September evening, was carrying a private knowledge that the other was more right than their public positions allowed them to admit. New York City, December 8, 1980. John Lennon was murdered. Paul McCartney heard the news in London. The details of his immediate response have been reported many times. The apparent inadequacy of his public statement in those first devastating hours. The 3 words that seemed insufficient to the magnitude of the loss. What has been reported less often is what happened in the days that followed. The private grief. The specific quality of losing someone with whom your relationship has been publicly defined by conflict and privately characterized by something considerably more complicated. Paul gave an interview in 1984 in which he addressed the question of what the Lyceum Ballroom evening had meant to him. The journalist who conducted it noted that he had been reluctant to discuss it and had required several months of requests before agreeing. What happened that night, Paul said, was the most embarrassing evening of my professional life. I had prepared something. I had planned it. I had gone there with a specific intention to say specific things publicly that I should have said privately. He paused. And John let me do it. He didn't stop me at the door. He didn't have security remove me. He let me walk onto his stage and say what I had prepared to say, in front of 2,000 people. And then he agreed with me. He was quiet for a moment. Do you know what it feels like to go to someone's concert specifically to humiliate them with truth, and have them agree with everything you say before you finish saying it? And then quietly, without any drama, point out that the problem wasn't the truth. It was you. I sat on that stool for the rest of his set thinking about how many times in the previous 14 months I had chosen the public method when the private one was available. How many interviews I had given that were aimed at John specifically and delivered to the world generally. How many songs I had written in response to his songs instead of picking up the phone. He was right. I should have called. I never told him that directly. After that night, I should have. And I didn't. And then he was gone. Paul's voice, in the recording of that interview, carried the specific quality of someone living with a specific, private regret that has no resolution available to it. The Lyceum Ballroom still stands on the Strand. Its ornate Victorian facade has been preserved through decades of London's constant architectural reinvention. It has been used as a concert venue, a theater, a nightclub, and a ballroom in its long history. Somewhere in its acoustic memory, in the way that great spaces absorb and retain the residue of extraordinary human events, there is the echo of a September evening in 1971. A man walking onto a stage uninvited, saying the prepared true thing. And the man he came to wound sitting down on the floor of his own stage and agreeing with it. 2,000 people who had come for a concert and witnessed something they would spend years trying to adequately describe. And a single question, asked quietly into a microphone by a man sitting cross-legged on the floor of the Lyceum Ballroom, that has never entirely stopped echoing. You could have called. 5 words. Quieter than any song John Lennon ever wrote. More devastating than anything Paul McCartney had prepared to say. The truth about a method that undermined a truth. Delivered without anger. Without cruelty, without performance, by a man sitting on the floor of his own stage, having just agreed with everything that had been said against him, choosing honesty over winning, and in doing so, winning completely. The official record of that evening notes a concert at the Lyceum Ballroom, September 1971. John Lennon, sold out. What the official record doesn't note is the second stool, the uninvited guest, the prepared criticism, delivered to a man who had already decided that agreement was more interesting than defense. Or the 5 words that turned the most public humiliation in Paul McCartney's career into a mirror. You could have called. 5 words. And the silence of 2,000 people, understanding that the most devastating response to a public attack is sometimes simply the truth about what it cost to deliver it that way. The end. If this story about the extraordinary power of choosing agreement over defense, the courage of public honesty, and the specific, costly grace of turning a confrontation into a mirror moved you, subscribe and leave that powerful like below. Share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the most devastating response to criticism is not a counterattack, but a quiet, honest agreement followed by an even quieter question. What relationship in your life do you wish could have had its hardest conversation differently? Tell us in the comments below.